All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into it, a big one, teacher efficacy.
Ooh,
So
yeah.
we're talking about, like, at its core, a teacher's own belief, that feeling that they can actually impact their students' learning, not just, in their classroom, but kind of like as part of the bigger school system.
Right, right. And it's actually, you know, more than just a teacher feeling good, right? There's been a lot of research, and it shows that a teacher's level of efficacy can really affect things like how they teach, how they deal with challenges, how their students feel about learning, even their achievements, right?
Yeah.
It's a pretty big deal in education, and a lot of researchers have been looking into it over the years.
So that's what we're diving into. We're going to look at how this whole research area around teacher efficacy has kind of changed, evolved over the last couple of decades, especially between 1998 and 2009.
Okay, yeah.
Which of course builds on all that earlier work, especially that big chunk of research from 1986 to 1997.
Right. And for this deep dive, we're using a really comprehensive review article from 2011. It was published in Educational Psychology Review, and the title kind of says it all. Teacher Efficacy Research, 1998-2009, Signs of Progress or Unfulfilled Promise. It's a really deep dive into the research. They looked at 218 empirical studies from that time period.
218, that's a lot. So what we're trying to do is, figure out what were the big questions back then? Where did the research take off? And were there any areas where it, I don't know, maybe it kind of stalled out or needed more attention? By the end, you'll have a really good picture of where this research stood at the turn of the millennium, which is kind of crazy to think about. Okay, so first things first, just how much research was being done back then? What did this review find?
Well, one of the most interesting things was just how much the number of studies exploded. Between 1998 and 2009, they published 218 articles.
Wow.
But if you compare that to the 12 years before, from 1986 to 1997, only 68 articles came out. That's a pretty big jump.
Yeah, that's not just a little increase. That's a huge surge in interest. And the review, it actually breaks it down. They found an average of 18.2 articles every year in that later period compared to just 5.7 before. I mean, that kind of growth really shows how important this topic was becoming for researchers.
It does.
Makes you wonder what was behind all that attention, right?
Yeah, for sure. It probably shows that more and more people in the field were starting to agree that teacher efficacy is super important in education, like really crucial. I think more researchers were recognizing how it could be a key to improving teaching and learning. And naturally, that led to, well, more research, more investigations.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So we have more research happening, but were they doing anything new? Like, were they using the same old methods, or were there, like, new approaches popping up?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The review highlights a pretty significant change in how they were doing research in that 1998-2009 period. So while quantitative methods, especially those cross-sectional surveys, were still the most popular, they were like over 80% of all the quantitative studies, there was a noticeable increase in qualitative and mixed methods approaches too.
Oh, okay. That makes sense, right? Because sometimes you need more than just numbers to really understand something. You need that deeper dive into a teacher's actual experiences and beliefs, and interviews and things like that can really get at those nuances.
Exactly.
I think the review had some good examples of this, right? Like some specific studies.
Yeah, it does. So, for example, in 2008, Cantrell and Calloway, they used individual interviews to really dig deep into teacher efficacy. And then back in 2005, Anna Fawara used focus groups to understand those shared efficacy beliefs among groups of teachers. Oh, and Bruce and Ross in 2008, they actually observed teachers in their classrooms, like, to see that connection between efficacy and what they were doing in practice.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is. And Chung, in their 2008 study, they included like open-ended questions in their survey so they could actually capture what teachers were thinking in their own words.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, and there are even more. Like Gabrielle and Joram used these talk aloud protocols in 2007 where teachers basically think out loud while they're making judgments about their efficacy. And then you have case studies by Milner and Woolfolk Hoy from the early 2000s. These case studies, they're basically told these in-depth stories of individual teachers and how their beliefs about efficacy played out in their specific situations. Puchner and Taylor even did a collective case study in 2006 looking at how teachers' self-efficacy was affected by, a teaching initiative they were all involved in. It seemed like researchers were really trying to move beyond those broad surveys to get a better understanding of the real lived experience of what teacher efficacy means.
I see. So it's like they were starting to ask why and how instead of just what and how much. But you said quantitative methods were still the most common.
Yeah.
Were there any interesting developments there aside from the usual surveys?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The review actually mentions a pretty big increase in longitudinal studies, which is really cool. So these studies, they basically follow the same teachers or groups of teachers over a longer time period, sometimes even
Oh,
years.
wow.
Right. It's pretty cool. Studies by, let's see, Browers and Tomic back in 2000, Schwartzer and Hallam in 2008, Henson in 2001, and Woolfolk Hoy and Burke Sparrow in 2005, they all tracked how teacher efficacy beliefs actually changed over time. This kind of research is super helpful because it lets us see how efficacy actually develops, instead of just getting a one-time glimpse. And there were also more experimental and quasi-experimental designs being used. Like Ross and Bruce in 2007, they went a step further. They actually created and tested a professional development program based specifically on the different sources of teacher efficacy to see if they could actually boost teachers' confidence.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And in a totally different area, Schwertfeger and their team, they were looking at something called the psychobiological correlates of teacher efficacy in 2008. So they were looking at things like heart rate and cortisol levels, like as indicators of how competent and stressed a teacher felt.
Wow. So they're not just asking teachers how they feel, but they're actually looking at their body's responses.
Exactly. They're moving towards more objective measures, which is really fascinating.
That's really cool. So we've got more research happening and it's getting more diverse in how it's being done. But, when we talk about teacher efficacy, a big part of it is understanding where it comes from, the sources that either build it up or, kind of tear it down. What does the research say about that?
Well, this is where the review gets a little, I guess, disappointed. Yeah, even though lots of big researchers have been saying how crucial it is to study the sources of teacher efficacy. Things like past successes, encouragement from others, seeing colleagues do well, even their own emotional state. The review found that only a handful of studies actually really looked into this between 1998 and 2009. Only 7, actually.
Really? That's surprising, especially when you think about how important those sources are to, like, Bandura's whole theory of self-efficacy. You'd think it'd be a much bigger focus of research. What did those few studies actually find?
Well, they did give us some valuable information, even though it wasn't a ton. Like, for instance, Adams and Forsyth in 2006, they found that the context of a school, like the actual environment, really affected how teachers saw their collective efficacy.
Oh, interesting.
Right. And Bruce and Ross, in their 2008 study, remember, they used multiple methods, and they did find evidence supporting the idea that those 4 sources, mastery experiences, verbal persuasion, vicarious experience, and physiological arousal, they all actually play a role in shaping a teacher's self-efficacy. Gabriel and Joram, in 2007, their research suggested that experienced teachers and brand new teachers might interpret their past experiences differently when they're forming their beliefs about efficacy. And then you have Chung's 2008 study, which was done in China, and they found some sources of efficacy that seem specific to that cultural context, along with some of the more universal ones.
Oh, that makes sense. Different cultures, different influences.
Exactly. And those case studies by Milner and Woolfolk Hoy, they gave us all these rich examples of how different sources affected individual teachers who are dealing with unique challenges. And, that experimental study by Ross and Bruce,
Yeah.
they showed that professional development programs, when they're specifically designed to tap into those sources, could actually make teachers feel more confident in areas like managing their classrooms. So there were definitely some interesting pieces of the puzzle there, but not the whole picture. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get it. Some intriguing findings, but not the in-depth exploration that you'd expect. Why do you think there was so little research on those sources of teacher efficacy during this time?
The review, it actually points to a pretty big obstacle. There just weren't any really good ways to measure the sources themselves. So we have ways to measure how much efficacy a teacher has overall, but trying to quantify things like the impact of a past success or, a nice comment from the principal, it's really hard to measure accurately.
I can see that.
And without good tools to measure those underlying sources, it's just really tough to do the kind of research that can tell us how they actually work and how they influence those beliefs about efficacy. It's like, trying to figure out what's in a cake without having measuring cups. You can guess, but you can't really be sure.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. So if you can't measure something accurately, it's really hard to study it. Makes sense. Now let's think about the different environments that teachers work in. I mean, teaching isn't one size fits all, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was there a trend towards looking at efficacy in specific subject areas or, different teaching roles?
Yeah, there definitely was an increase in research on what they call domain-specific teacher efficacy. So we saw more studies looking at things like science teaching efficacy, confidence in using technology in the classroom, math teaching efficacy, literacy instruction, even physical education.
Okay.
But, and this is important, the review points out that this kind of research, while it grew, it didn't really grow at the same rate as the overall research on teacher efficacy.
Oh, so it wasn't like a big shift away from looking at teaching in a more general way.
Right, exactly. Domain general self-efficacy, which is basically a teacher's confidence in their teaching abilities across the board, regardless of the subject, that was still the most studied area, making up about 60% of the research. Science teaching self-efficacy was second, around 15%.
And I bet there's this ongoing debate in the field about how specific those measures should be, right? Because you want a measure that really captures the challenges of teaching a specific subject, but you also want it to be applicable and informative in a broader sense.
Absolutely. It's like walking a tightrope between being very specific and being general.
Exactly.
Like really specific measures, they might tell you how confident a teacher is in teaching, I don't know, fractions, but they might not tell you anything about their confidence in managing the classroom or dealing with different student needs. But on the other hand, super general measures might miss those unique challenges and sources of efficacy that are specific to, teaching different subjects. It's tricky.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. Was this research mostly happening in one part of the world, or was it becoming more international?
Well, this is something the review highlights as a really positive development. There was a much bigger increase in research on teacher efficacy happening outside of North America during that 1998-2009 period.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, it really is, because it's so important to understand how teacher efficacy works in different cultural and educational systems.
Definitely. It's crucial to see how these ideas play out in diverse settings. Where was most of this growth happening? Geographically, I mean.
It seemed like a lot of research was coming from Asia, especially Hong Kong and Singapore, and also from Europe. But they also pointed out that at that time, there wasn't as much research coming from South America and Africa.
And did researchers start looking into how cultural factors might affect teacher efficacy beliefs?
Yeah, there was definitely an increase in cross-cultural studies where researchers were comparing teacher efficacy beliefs in different countries. It's interesting. In the review, they actually say that because they only looked at English language publications, they probably underestimated how much international research was actually going on. They also mentioned a call from Pajares in 2007 for research that's more culturally sensitive, research that really dives into how those cultural differences affect motivation and beliefs in education.
Right.
It's a good reminder that these concepts, they're not always universal, and they can be shaped by, different cultural norms and values.
Definitely. We can't just assume that a Western perspective is the only one that matters.
Hmm.
Now, there's another big part of teacher efficacy that we haven't talked about yet. Collective efficacy. That's the idea that teachers in a school share a belief that they can make a difference together. What did the research say about this?
Collective efficacy definitely got more attention during that period. The review really highlights the work of Goddard and his team, which really took off in the early 2000s. They helped to really define what collective teacher efficacy is and came up with reliable ways to measure it.
Okay.
And then we started seeing more and more studies looking at the connection between a school's collective sense of efficacy and things like overall student achievement and the general academic environment.
And what about those connections? Were they strong? I think the review mentioned that there was a range in how much influence collective efficacy seemed to have.
Yeah, that's right. Studies by Goddard's team, Hoy and his colleagues, and Shannon Moran and Barr, they all found a positive correlation between collective efficacy and how well students did across the school. The exact amount of influence was different in each study, but overall it seemed like when teachers in a school believe they can make a difference together, it really does have a positive effect on student learning at the school level. It's like that shared belief creates a better learning environment.
That's pretty cool. The idea that this shared feeling of we can do this
Yeah.
among the staff can actually make a difference. But was the research on collective efficacy as diverse as the research on individual teacher efficacy?
Not really. The review points out that most research on collective efficacy was still quantitative, using a lot of surveys. There weren't as many qualitative studies that really explored how those shared beliefs actually develop in a school, how they're maintained, and how they're affected by the specific context and culture of the school. And longitudinal studies, those that track things over time, they were also less common.
So we've covered a lot about the growth and the scope of teacher efficacy research, but the title of that review article, Signs of Progress or Unfulfilled Promise, it kind of hints that there were still some problems or areas where the research wasn't quite there yet. What were some of the biggest concerns?
Yeah, that's a really important part of the review. One of the biggest concerns was that researchers kept using measures of teacher efficacy that were just conceptually flawed, especially different versions of the Gibson and Dembo teacher efficacy scale, which is really old, from 1984.
Oh, wow.
I know, right? And even though lots of experts had pointed out the problems with this scale, people kept using it.
Okay, so what were the problems? Why was it so bad?
The main problem is that the Gibson and Dembo scale, especially that general teaching efficacy part of it, focuses on what teachers believe about how much things outside their control, like a student's home life or their natural ability, affect their learning. Instead of focusing on how much the teacher themselves can actually impact learning, it gets mixed up with all these external factors. True self-efficacy, like Bandura originally defined it, it's about what you believe you can do to achieve something. It's about your own power and agency.
So it should be about what the teacher believes they can do, not about all the other stuff going on in a student's life that they can't control.
Exactly. And this problem, unfortunately, it kind of spread to some of those domain-specific measures too, like the Science Teaching Efficacy Beliefs Instrument, which was built on similar ideas. The review actually gives examples of specific questions from different studies that just don't fit with the whole idea of self-efficacy, like asking a teacher how they felt about their skills in the past, or whether they get along with the administrators, or comparing themselves to other teachers. These aren't really measuring a teacher's confidence in their ability to do their job effectively.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty big problem. If you're using the wrong tools to measure something, how can you trust the results, right? Were there any studies that used better measures of teacher efficacy, measures that were, more accurate?
Yeah, there were, thankfully. The review mentions studies by Caprara and his colleagues, and research using the Teacher Sense of Efficacy scale by Shannon Moran and Wolf Okoye. These measures are much better because they really focus on that forward-looking sense of what a teacher believes they can do in their teaching, and they're often more specific to certain situations, like asking a teacher how confident they feel about getting even the toughest students engaged in their work. That's much closer to what self-efficacy really means. The review emphasizes that difference between efficacy beliefs, like, can I do this, and outcome expectancies, which is more like, what's going to happen if I do this? Those bad measures, they often confuse these two things.
All right, so measurement was a problem. What about the big question, the one everyone wants to know? How does teacher efficacy actually affect student learning? Did the research give us an answer?
Well, this is another area where the review found a surprising lack of research. Going back to that earlier period, from 1986 to 1997, only a tiny percentage of studies, like 4%, looked at the direct connection between teacher efficacy and how well students were learning. And those that did, they often used that problematic teacher efficacy scale, so the results weren't super clear.
Did that change between 1998 and 2009 with all that new research happening?
Not as much as you'd think. Only about 3% of the studies in that later period actually looked at this connection. Of those, 4 focused on collective efficacy, and like we talked about, they generally found a positive link with how well students did across the school. But research on how individual teachers' self-efficacy affects their students' learning, that was really rare. There were only a couple of studies, and they showed a pretty weak connection.
That's a big gap, right? I mean, you'd think figuring out how a teacher's belief themselves actually translates into better results for their students would be the main goal.
It really should be. The authors of the review even say they're concerned about this lack of evidence at the classroom level. Because the whole idea behind this research is that when teachers believe in themselves, they teach better and their students learn more. But there just wasn't enough research directly testing this, especially for individual teachers and their own students.
So with all this research going on, the review asks a really good question about its usefulness. How can we make all this knowledge actually relevant and helpful for the people who are actually doing the work, the teachers and principals?
That's a great question, because if we don't know where efficacy comes from or how it directly affects students, how can we actually help teachers? The review suggests a few things we could do. One is more research on how teacher training programs can build up efficacy in new teachers from the very beginning.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They also talk about getting researchers and teachers working together more. So the research is actually focused on the real challenges that teachers face, and the findings are more useful. And like we just discussed, we really need more research that directly looks at how teacher efficacy, especially that individual self-efficacy, affects student learning in the classroom.
Okay, so big picture. What are the main takeaways from all this research on teacher efficacy between 1998 and 2009?
Well, we definitely saw the field grow like crazy in terms of how much research was being done, and that's a good thing. There were more diverse research methods being used, more focus on specific subject areas, a more international perspective, and more interest in collective efficacy. But there were also some big challenges. We still don't know enough about what creates teacher efficacy, and there were still problems with how it was being measured in a lot of studies. And maybe most importantly, we need a lot more research on that direct link between a teacher's belief in themselves and how well their students actually learn.
It all goes back to that core belief, doesn't it, that teachers can make a difference.
It really does. That belief is like the engine that drives everything. It affects their dedication, their choices in the classroom, their ability to bounce back from setbacks, and ultimately how their students experience learning and how well they succeed.
So, thinking about everything we've discussed today, here's something to think about. If we know all this about the progress and the gaps in teacher efficacy research from that time, what specific things could teacher training programs or school leaders actually do to support and build up teacher efficacy in a way that will really make a difference for student learning in the classroom? It's a big question, but definitely worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.